And now for something almost completely different. How to survive on Mercury, a beginner's guide. Mercury is much closer to the Sun than the Earth. In fact, it's less than half the distance. The practical upshot is that if you were to look at the Sun in the sky on Mercury, it's about twice the size, or 4 times the angular surface area. Good, so there's our little benchmark to remind us how big the Sun looks from the Earth. That means that on Mercury, you get 4 times the solar energy per unit area that you would here on Earth, or it's 4 times as bright on the surface of Mercury as it is here on Earth. But what would that look like in practice?
Cool, so here I have a Fresnel lens. It's basically a very flat lens. Now I'm going to use this to show you what sunlight looks like on Mercury. So if I get the image of the Sun, you know, the same size as the lens itself, that's basically 100% sun power, 1 sun power. And on Mercury, it's about 4 times the intensity, which means the image of the Sun has to be about half the size. That's basically what the Sun looks like 100% of the time on Mercury. Well, that's the intensity of sunlight on Mercury, which you will see if we do more or less the same thing here on some leaves. Not that big of a deal. It will get pretty toasty eventually. However, if I make that a degree more intense, you will find that things catch fire pretty quickly. But you know, at this point, you've got to be really close to the Sun, right? Just getting down to 4 times solar intensity. It's harsh for short periods of time, but you know, you have to get it about 100 times or something more intense before, you know, things will just sort of burst into flames like that.
Fantastic, I hear you say. I've got this brilliant idea. Why don't we put all of our solar panels, even better, all of our solar freaking roadways on Mercury? Because they would generate at least 4 times the energy that they do here on Earth, given that there's no clouds and no atmosphere. And even more impressive, they won't wear out like they do here on Earth in less than a year, because no one's going to be driving cars on them. So it's dead easy. You just move all your solar panels to Mercury and then just hook up a giant power cable and boom, instant, cheap, free power. It's so obvious. Why did no one think of this before? Well, not quite. Turns out there are some significant drawbacks to this. Some rather obvious killers, which I'll come back to later. Now at this point, I'm going to give you a rather bizarre fact that might seem to come out of left field. If you look at Saturn at the moment, you'll notice that there's this little dot nearby that's slowly going around Saturn. That's Titan.
Gain, that sounds hopeful. Oh. Okay, that's as much gain as we can get. That's a bit much on the gain. Let's try that as a start. So, the big one's Titan.
It's a distant and very, very cold moon. But there's an interesting human touch in that there's actually a device made on planet Earth currently sat there on the surface of Titan. Now, Titan is almost the opposite of Mercury in that it's 10 times further away from the Sun than the Earth. The practical upshot is there's only 1/100th of the solar energy available at Saturn or Titan. This means that when we sent the spaceship out there to drop the Huygens lander onto Saturn, it couldn't rely on solar power. It would have just been too weak. So it had a radioisotope generator on board. It was nuclear powered. However, the lander didn't even have one of those because it was too big and too heavy. So it had batteries. And when those batteries went flat, the lander died. So, yes, whilst it's true there is a human-made lander on the surface of Titan, it's kind of dead. In fact, it's one of those things that's always been on my bucket list, to charge some batteries on Mercury and then use those to juice the lander on Titan. Why? There are no reasons. It would just be kind of cool. Now you might be thinking, why do you bring up Titan and all that sort of thing? Well, doesn't it strike you as kind of weird that we've landed something on a moon of Saturn 10 astronomical units away. By the way, an astronomical unit is just the distance between the Earth and the Sun. It's a sort of yardstick used by astronomers. So we've landed a probe over 10 astronomical units away, but we've never landed a probe on Mercury, which is only half an astronomical unit away. Well, the reason is another inverse squared law: gravity. If you want to blast off from the surface of the Earth and leave the solar system, you need to be going about 17 kilometers per second. And a lot of that is helped by the fact that you're actually on a platform that is whizzing around the sun at about 30 kilometers per second. Yep, that's the orbital velocity of the Earth around the sun, 30 kilometers per second. About 100 times the speed of sound. But you would still need an extra 17 kilometers per second to get out of the solar system. But curiously, it takes almost as much energy to get a probe to the surface of Mercury, for several reasons. Firstly is that Mercury has no atmosphere. That means no aerobraking like you could do with the Huygens lander or the myriad of Mars landers. You want to land on Mercury, you've got to pack all the rocket fuel to slow your probe down. The second reason it takes so much energy to go to Mercury is obvious when you just look at the orbital velocities of this planet. Mercury is close to the Sun. You really feel the Sun's gravity there. Mercury hammers around the Sun about every 88 days. And these are some of the key reasons why no one has ever landed a probe on the surface of Mercury, despite it almost being on our doorstep. But we have landed a probe on Titan, half the solar system away. Cool, so on Mercury, getting power from solar is easy. 4 times the solar energy that you would get here on Earth. Now, for short periods of time, for you, this wouldn't be a great problem. For longer periods, however, it's going to get a little hotter, and then a little hotter, and then a little hotter until you're at the surface temperature of Mercury, which is a rather toasty 400 degrees Celsius, a more healthy temperature for molten lead rather than summer picnics. But it's still not the hottest planet in the solar system. That prize goes to Venus with its spectacular runaway greenhouse effect. So the key difference between, say, for instance, the surface of Mercury and the surface of Venus is that Mercury would be like being in a really intense tanning salon. Meanwhile, being on Venus would be more akin to being in a giant toaster oven / pressure cooker with 100 atmospheres of pressure of mostly carbon dioxide with sulfuric acid rain, and where you never actually get to see the sun from the surface of the planet. Okay, so with Mercury, being out in the daylight really isn't an option. So it's simple. You stay on the dark side of the planet. Well, not so fast. Nighttime on Mercury lasts about 6 months. And the temperature gets down to some minus 170 degrees Celsius, almost cold enough to liquefy nitrogen, certainly enough to turn you into a block of ice. That being said, the night skies on Mercury would blow the socks off anything you would get here on Earth, because there's no atmosphere. Plus, once a night, a brilliant white / bluish star would rise and set. Well, actually, okay, not quite just some insignificant star. You would see the Earth rise and set at least once per night. And it would be the third brightest object in the sky after the Sun and Venus. Now, you wouldn't quite be able to resolve it as a disk with the naked eye, but in a telescope it would look spectacular. But, of course, you would be kind of freezing to death while this happened. Isn't there some way you could see this awesome sight without, well, dying? Okay, it's simple. You have lots of power from solar, but you can't sit in the sunlight. So all you got to do is get just below the horizon and then stick a long crane up with your solar panels to get energy. And then you use that energy to charge your batteries and run your heaters. And then you just keep driving such that you're perpetually just in the darkness. But the solar panels are just in the light. Now, Mercury is actually tiny for a planet. It's just bigger than the Moon. So its circumference is some 15,000 odd kilometers. And it rotates, Well, actually, it's kind of complicated, but a day on Mercury is about 150 days. And by a day, I mean the time between one sunrise and the next sunrise. So you have to travel about 15,000 kilometers in 150 days. That's 100 kilometers per day. So that's only 4 kilometers per hour, about walking speed. But this Sisyphean task might make you a little weary, especially given the fact that one flat tire and you will be out of the range of the sunlight and you'll have to go some 80 days at liquid nitrogen temperature until you get to the other horizon. Or, if you're on the other horizon playing the same game, it's some 80 days at molten lead temperature before you can get back to where it's cool again. And life on this knife edge might be a little stressful. Plus, of course, there is absolutely no way to tell when sunrise is about to happen. Unless, of course, you've been keeping track of the stars. Because it's not like here on Earth with the spectacular sunrises and sunsets and the such like. There is no atmosphere on Mercury. The first thing you would know about sunrise is when the giant nuclear fireball creeps above the horizon. So is there a less stressful way of living on Mercury? Why, yes. Yes, there is. It turns out that there are craters near the poles of Mercury that are always in the darkness. That is, they are always frozen. In fact, in those craters, there's water ice. So now you have a relatively stress-free way of living on Mercury. You just set up camp in a crater and poke your solar panels over the top. And boom, not only are you mostly protected from the solar wind, which would absolutely rake Mercury, but you now have all the power you want. And all you do is rotate those solar panels about once per Mercurian day. What's more, you could have some awesome saunas on Mercury. That is, if you can take the lack of atmosphere in good humor. Yeah, long before people thought every new Star Wars movie was the worst ever, and a long time before people had coined the term cinematic universe, we had the awesome 80s with movies like Superman 4, where Superman, in an act of cosmic vandalism, decides to move the moon. Why? Well, of course, to cut off the sunlight from Nuclear Man so he can go and save his girlfriend, who, for some bizarre reason, isn't worried about the lack of air in space, but that it's a long way to fall back to Earth. Hell, at least The Last Jedi was a tissue of plot holes. But at least it was a tissue. This was more like, excuse me, waiter, there's some plot in my hole. Anyway, so, where was I? Ah, yes, saunas. A good sauna, you see, you get as hot as you can and then you go and roll in the snow to cool off afterwards. On Mercury, this takes it to professional levels, in that you can go up to the rim of the crater where you would be in the full sunlight and get really, really toasty, and then quickly run and roll in the ice in the crater at liquid nitrogen temperatures. Which, oddly enough, is also on my bucket list. Swimming with the whales is for amateurs. So I hope you enjoyed that enough to drop a like on it and subscribe if you don't want to miss out on more like this. Saturn's rings, by the way, are spectacular at the moment, and any telescope on my Amazon store below will give you good views of this beautiful little cosmic gem. Or if you want to support this channel more directly, you can do it through Patreon, and I'll leave the links below.
So quite often